Welcome, seekers. Welcome back to the Ruby Tablet of Set. I am your host, Ariel. And in the last episode, we stood upon the banks of the Nile, gazing into the serene, ordered world of ancient Egypt. We spoke of the Neteru, the conscious principles of nature, and a people who sought harmony, symmetry, and a cyclical existence where the divine was manifest in the very structure of reality itself. We saw a civilization that built for eternity under the watchful, stable gaze of a living God King. Tonight, we turn our gaze north and east, to the land between the rivers, to a world forged in a different crucible, a land called Mesopotamia. Where Egypt was the gift of the Nile, a predictable, life-giving inundation, Mesopotamia was born between the capricious waters of the Tigris and the Euphrates. Floods that could come without warning, unpredictable storms, a desert that could swallow a city. It is from this environment that a profoundly different philosophy of life, death, and the divine emerged. Tonight we are delving into essay number 2. It's called Mesopotamian Philosophy, written by Michael Aquino. We will journey from the first cities of Sumer to the great empires of Babylon and Assyria, and trace its philosophical echoes all the way to the foundations of Western religion. We will explore what it means to live in a world ruled by fickle gods, to serve a cosmos of divine whim rather than divine order. And we will ask, what is the legacy of this ancient, pessimistic, yet deeply influential way of thinking? So sit back, open your mind. Let us begin our descent into the Fertile Crescent. Now, before we get into the gods and the philosophies, we need to understand the stage upon which this drama is set. Egypt, as we discussed, was a land of remarkable geographical isolation. Protected by deserts and seas, it was a place where culture could develop with a powerful sense of internal continuity and stability. The sun rose, the sun set, the Nile flooded, and the world in its essence was fundamentally stable. Mesopotamia was the opposite. As the text tells us, it was characterized by harsher and more unpredictable elements. This isn't just an academic observation, it is the primary key to unlocking the entire Mesopotamian mindset. You have to understand, the Tigris and the Euphrates were violent rivers. They didn't just flood, they could surge violently, unpredictably, wiping out irrigation systems, villages, and entire cities. The storms that rolled in from the Persian Gulf were ferocious. The sun, when it shone, was baking and relentless. The world for Mesopotamians was not a place of calm, geometric perfection. It was a place of sudden violence, chaotic energy, and precarious survival. And as we see in many early philosophical systems, the gods were a reflection of this world. Because if your environment is unpredictable and hostile, you don't create gods who are calm, stable, and principled. You create gods who are powerful, capricious, and terrifying. You create gods who are as prone to rage and jealousy as the rivers are to flood and the storms to destroy. Our text mentions the generally harsher and more unpredictable elements in Mesopotamia may partially explain the generally harsher and more unpredictable personalities of the Mesopotamian gods, especially in contrast to the Egyptian Neteru. This is a crucial point. The Egyptian Neteru were forces of nature, but they were forces of regularity. They were the principles of creation, balance, and order. Things like Ma'at, the principle of truth and justice. They are not just in nature, they are the very intelligibility of nature. The Mesopotamian gods were something else entirely. They are anthropomorphic, which means they are given human shapes, human desires, and most importantly, human flaws. They were not abstract principles, they were superpowered, immortal versions of humans. They got hungry, they got angry, they got jealous, they made mistakes, and they could be cruel. Think about the implication of that for a second. If your God is a living principle of justice, your world is a world of justice. If your God is a sky god who can be petulant, your world is a world of divine whims. Your job is not to find harmony with the natural order, It is to keep the gods happy, to appease them, to try and avoid their wrath. And that, as we shall see, creates a very different kind of society and a very different vision of the human condition. Our last essay explained that Egypt was divided into 42 nomes, or provinces. It had a highly centralized state from the very beginning of its recorded history, under the direct control of the pharaoh god. Mesopotamia was different. It was a land of city-states. The earliest cultures, like Sumer, were localized and even had elements of democracy. The elders of the city would select a king or military leader in times of crisis. Your primary loyalty wasn't to a nation called Mesopotamia, it was to your city, its patron god, and its temple. This localism created a patchwork of fiercely independent, competitive, and constantly warring states. They were bound together by a shared culture, a common literary tradition, and a network of religious ties. But politically, they were fractious. It was only when the great empires of the Babylonians and the Assyrians that we see this kind of top down control that Egypt had from the very start. This brings us to ask why. The text suggests that permanent monarchies are assumed to have arisen because of increasing external threats to local tribes, coupled with ambition by would be dynastic founders. Survival, external pressure, and human ambition. This is the crucible of Mesopotamian civilization. It wasn't born from a stable foundation and a desire for cosmic order. It was forged in the fires of constant warfare and the constant desperate effort to appease temperamental gods. Our essay argues that the harsh, unpredictable environment of Mesopotamia directly shaped the harsh, unpredictable personalities of its gods. If the Mesopotamians had lived in the stable, predictable environment of Egypt, would their entire theology have been different? Or is there something inherently human about creating gods in our own flawed image, regardless of where we live? I think environment absolutely shapes how we imagine the divine, but I also think there's something deeply human about projecting our own psychology onto the cosmos. Let's start with the environmental side, because I think it's incredibly compelling. Imagine you're an ancient Sumerian. You live in a world where the rivers can suddenly surge and wipe out your entire village. The storms that roll in off the Persian Gulf are violent and unpredictable. The sun, when it's not baking you alive, can disappear behind clouds that bring devastating floods. Your entire existence is in negotiation with forces you cannot control and cannot predict. Now imagine you're an ancient Egyptian. The Nile rises and falls with near clockwork precision. The sun crosses the sky in an unchanging arc. The winds blow in predictable patterns. Your world is one of regularity, of patterns you can observe and understand. If you're the Sumerian, you're going to imagine gods who are like the rivers, powerful, capricious, sometimes benevolent, sometimes destructive. You're going to imagine gods who need to be appeased, who can be angered, who have moods and whims. You're going to imagine gods who are basically superpowered humans, because that's the only model you have for understanding unpredictable power. If you're the Egyptian, you're going to imagine gods who are like the Nile, orderly, life giving, operating according to principles you can observe and trust. You're going to imagine gods who are principles, not personalities. The Neteru aren't capricious, they're the very fabric of a stable, intelligible universe. So, yes, I think environment absolutely shapes theology. The essay is right about that. But here's where I push back a little. There's another layer to this. Human beings, regardless of where we live, have a tendency to anthropomorphize. We see faces in clouds, we hear voices in the wind, we project our own emotions, our own desires, our own flaws onto the universe around us. It's a cognitive bias that's baked into how our brains work. So even if the Mesopotamians had lived in a stable environment, I suspect they might have still created gods who were recognizably human in their psychology. Maybe those gods would have been more benevolent, more orderly, but they still might have been persons with wills and desires. I think the real question is less about whether environment shapes theology, because of course it does, and more about what we lose or gain when we imagine the divine in a particular way. The Egyptian vision gives us a universe that is knowable, harmonious, and ultimately just. The Mesopotamian vision gives us a universe that is awe-inspiring, humbling, and deeply aware of human vulnerability. And honestly, I think we need both. We need the comfort of a cosmos that makes sense, and we need the humility of a cosmos that doesn't revolve around us. The Egyptians gave us one, the Mesopotamians gave us the other, and we're still trying to reconcile them today. This brings us to a central figure in both societies, the king. But here the difference is absolutely stark and foundational. In Egypt, the pharaoh was a god, a living god. His position was not just political, it was ontological. He was Horus, the son of Osiris and Isis. He was the divine intermediary on earth, and his actions were a reflection of the cosmic order of Maat. As our essay states, the monarchy was closely controlled by the various orders of priesthood, with the pharaoh acting as an earthly deputy of an interpreter for the Neteru. He was part of the divine machinery of the universe. Now let's look at the Mesopotamian king. He was called the Lugal, meaning big man in Sumerian. His role, as our text puts it, was similar to the pharaoh's in a practical sense. He was responsible for running the kingdom, leading the armies, and building the temples. But theologically, he was human. The text is very clear. The king was responsible to the gods for the running of the kingdom, and himself was not considered one of them. This is a tectonic shift in political and philosophical thought. The king is not the embodiment of a divine principle. He is like a manager, the steward of a divine estate. He is a high priest, a chief general, and a powerful human, but he is not a god. The essay notes that fewer than 20 Mesopotamian kings between 2300 and 1500 BC laid claim to personal divinity, and those who did, like the great Sargon of Akkad, were seen as exceptional, and their claims were often met with suspicion. Because the divine king is the ultimate symbol of a stable, ordered universe. If the king is a god, then the universe is inherently divine and ordered. If the king is a human who has been chosen by the gods, but is not one himself, then there is a fundamental separation between the human and the divine. The divine is out there, separate from you, demanding service. In Egypt, the gods were self sufficient principles of nature. In Mesopotamia, the gods created humanity to serve them. They needed us to feed them, to clothe them, and to keep them happy. That's a pretty desperate, needy deity. Which is more terrifying? A god who doesn't need you at all and is indifferent to your existence, or a god who desperately needs your service and will punish you if you don't deliver? This is genuinely an unsettling question, and I don't think there's an easy answer. Both options are terrifying in their own way, but I think they terrify us for fundamentally different reasons. Let's start with the Egyptian model, the god who doesn't need you. The Neteru are self sufficient, they are the principles of reality itself. They don't require your worship, your sacrifices, or your obedience to exist or to function. The sun will rise whether you pray to Ra or not. The Nile will flood whether you honor Hapi or not. Now, on the surface, that might sound liberating. You're not responsible for keeping the universe running. You can't make the gods angry by forgetting a ritual. There's a certain peace in knowing that the cosmos is bigger than you and doesn't depend on you. But there is a dark side to that vision. If the gods don't need you, then what is your purpose? If the universe is self sufficient and indifferent, then you are fundamentally unnecessary. You're not part of the cosmic machinery, you're just there. Your existence has no cosmic significance. You're a temporary blip in an eternal system that would function perfectly well without you. That could be a cold, lonely vision. It's the vision that has been called absurd, the realization that the universe doesn't care about us, and we have to create our own meaning in the face of that indifference. The Egyptian worldview has this built into its theology. The gods are self sufficient, so your role is simply to exist in harmony with them. You're not saving the universe, you're just being part of it. Now let's look at the Mesopotamian model. The gods created humans because they were tired of doing all the work themselves. We are, in a very real sense, divine servants. The gods need us to feed them, clothe them, build their temples, and perform their rituals. Without us, they'd have to do it themselves, and they just don't want to. That's also terrifying, but for different reasons. If the gods need you, then you are important. Your existence has cosmic significance. The universe literally depends on you to function. But that importance comes at a terrible cost. You are always at risk of failure. If you don't perform the rituals correctly, if you don't keep the gods happy, the consequences could be catastrophic. The gods are needy, demanding, and quick to anger. You're living on a knife's edge, constantly trying to appease forces that are infinitely more powerful than you are. So, which is more terrifying? Well, I think the Mesopotamian model is immediately more terrifying. It's the terror of the abusive relationship. You matter, but only insofar as you serve. Your value is conditional. If you fail, you're punished. The gods are like a volatile parent or a tyrannical boss. You're constantly walking on eggshells, trying to anticipate their moods and meet their demands. But the Egyptian model has a deeper existential terror. It's the terror of meaninglessness. If the gods don't need you, then nothing you do ultimately matters. You can live a good life or a bad life. You can be virtuous or corrupt, and it doesn't change the cosmic balance. The universe is indifferent to your choices. I think different people will find different answers here. I think different people will find different answers here. If you're someone who craves significance, who wants to feel that your actions matter, the Mesopotamian model might actually feel more meaningful, even if it is more stressful. If you're someone who craves peace, who wants to be free from the burden of cosmic responsibility, the Egyptian model might actually be more appealing. Personally, I find both terrifying in their own ways, and I suspect that's why we've spent thousands of years trying to find a third option. A God who loves us but doesn't need us, who cares about us but isn't dependent on us. That's the theological sweet spot that most modern religions try to occupy. Whether they succeed is another question entirely. Now we find one of the most striking and philosophically interesting practices in the Mesopotamian culture. Let's talk about the substitute king. Imagine this. The priests scan the heavens. They read the entrails of a sheep. They determine that a great disaster is coming, an eclipse, a plague, a foreign invasion. The gods are angry, and their wrath is going to fall on the king. In Egypt, this would mean the divine pharaoh's cosmic role is being challenged, and the entire nation is at stake. In Mesopotamia, they had an innovative solution, we could say. The text tells us that substitute kings were occasionally employed in Mesopotamia to preserve the real ones from divine wrath or physical danger. In Egypt, this never happened. The actual pharaoh remained completely accountable, no matter what. So the Mesopotamians would take a convict, a commoner, or a political prisoner and dress him up in the king's robes. They would place him on the throne. He would be called the king. The real king would go into hiding, awaiting the catastrophe. And for a few days, this substitute king would rule. He would enjoy the pleasures of the court, and then the omens would be checked again. Say it was found that the danger had passed. The god's wrath was satisfied. The substitute king would then be swiftly executed to make sure that the bad luck couldn't follow the real king. Now, think about the philosophical implications of this. In Egypt, the pharaoh is the ultimate example of Ma'at. He is the principle of order. He cannot be replaced because the principle itself cannot be replaced. The god king rules in a universe of stability. In Mesopotamia, the king is a piece on a cosmic chessboard. He is not central to the nature of the universe. He's a target. The universe is seen as a dangerous place where bad things happen to people in power, so you need a human scapegoat. This practice is a microcosm of the entire Mesopotamian worldview. It is pragmatic, cynical, and deeply fatalistic. The universe is a place of danger and doom. It is not benevolent. It must be managed, and sometimes it must be tricked. This practice of the substitute king is one of the most bizarre and revealing things I've ever come across in philosophy. The Mesopotamians would literally dress up a convict, put him on the throne, let him enjoy the good life for a few days, and then execute him to absorb the god's wrath. What does this say about their view of power? And more importantly, could any modern political or corporate leader be so humble or so terrified that they would willingly step aside and let a scapegoat take the fall for a disaster that they didn't cause? The substitute king practice is one of those historical artifacts that feels almost impossible to process because it's so far outside our modern framework of power, responsibility, and leadership. Let's start with what it says about their view of power. In Mesopotamia, power is fundamentally precarious. The king is not the embodiment of divine order like the Egyptian pharaoh. He's a mortal man who has been chosen by the gods, but that favor can be withdrawn at any moment. If the gods are angry, if there's an eclipse, a plague, a military defeat, it means the king has somehow displeased them. Now, in most monarchies, the response to a crisis would be for the king to double down, to prove his legitimacy through strength, or to blame his enemies. But the Mesopotamians did something else. They said, the gods are angry and they're going to punish the king, but we can't afford to lose the king. He's the administrator of the entire kingdom. So let's find someone else to absorb the punishment, and then we'll kill that person to make sure the bad luck doesn't follow. This reveals a remarkably pragmatic and surprisingly humble view of power. The king is not so arrogant that he believes he's invincible or beyond the reach of divine justice. He knows he's vulnerable. He knows the gods can strike him down, and he's willing to admit that vulnerability and take extraordinary measures to protect himself. But there's also a deeply cynical view of power embedded in this practice. The king is, in a very real sense, cheating. He's using the substitute king to deflect divine punishment that should rightfully fall on him. He's putting an innocent, or at least less guilty, person in harm's way to save his own skin. That's not noble. That's cowardice, dressed up as ritual. Now to the second part of the question. Could a modern leader do this? Well, on one level, the answer is no. We don't have the theological framework for it. We don't believe in gods whose wrath can be tricked by a human sacrifice. The substitute king practice only makes sense within a worldview that takes divine anger literally and believes that ritual action can manipulate cosmic forces. But on another level, don't we already do something like this? Think about the modern equivalent. When a company has a massive scandal, who gets fired? Usually the CEO's subordinates. The CEO gets a golden parachute and walks away. When a political leader faces a crisis, who takes the fall? The cabinet member, the advisor, the bureaucrat. The leader stays in place. We use scapegoats all the time. We just don't call them substitute kings. We call them fall guys. The difference is that we've secularized the practice. We don't believe the scapegoat is absorbing divine wrath. We believe they're absorbing public anger, political blame, or legal liability. But the mechanics are remarkably similar. Someone lower down on the power hierarchy is sacrificed to protect someone higher up. So could a modern leader willingly step aside and let a scapegoat take the fall? Absolutely. They do it all the time. The difference is that they don't execute the scapegoat afterward. They just fire them or let them resign or make them the subject of a media firestorm. It's the same impulse, just in a more humane package. But the real question is whether a modern leader would ever say, the gods are angry at me specifically, so I'm going to hide while someone else takes my place. That's the humbling part. That's the recognition that power is fragile and that even the most powerful person is vulnerable to forces beyond their control. I don't think many modern leaders would do that. Our leaders tend to believe in their own invincibility. They surround themselves with sycophants and spin doctors. In Mesopotamian culture, there was a concept called shulmu. It meant community well-being that leads to peace, and it is contrasted with Egypt's concept of cosmic harmony. We often talk about peace as the absence of conflict, but this is about the presence of well-being, which is harder to achieve, harmony with the cosmos or harmony with your neighbor. This is a rich question because it gets to the heart of what we actually mean when we say peace. We tend to think of peace as the absence of war. If there's no active conflict, we say there's peace. But that's a thin, negative definition. It's the peace of a cold war. No bullets flying, but also no trust, no cooperation, no genuine connection. It's the peace of two neighbors who don't speak to each other. It's not peace, it's just a ceasefire. Shulmu is something deeper. It's not just the absence of conflict, it's the presence of well being. It's a community where people are flourishing, where relationships are healthy, where there's trust and mutual support. The Akkadian root of shulmu is related to the Hebrew shalom, and like shalom, it implies wholeness, completeness, and health. When you say shalom to someone, you're not just saying, I hope we don't fight. You're saying, I hope you are whole. I hope everything in your life is as it should be. So, which is harder to achieve, harmony with the cosmos or harmony with your neighbor? Let's start with cosmic harmony. The Egyptian version of this is Me'at. It's the principle of truth, justice, balance, and order. To live in harmony with Me'at means to align your actions with the fundamental structure of reality. You're not trying to change the cosmos, you're trying to fit into it. You observe the patterns, you respect the cycles, and you do your part within the grand design. On one level, this sounds like it might be the easier goal. The cosmos is vast, but it's also predictable. The sun rises, the Nile floods, the seasons change. If you pay attention and live accordingly, you can achieve a kind of cosmic peace. But there's a catch. The cosmos doesn't care about you personally. If you harm your neighbor, the cosmos doesn't intervene. The cosmic order isn't necessarily just in human terms. Mayat doesn't punish the wicked, at least not directly. The cosmic order is impersonal. It's beautiful, but it's indifferent. Now, let's examine harmony with the neighbor. Shulmu. This is by far the harder goal, because your neighbor is a complex, flawed, unpredictable human being. They have their own desires, their own grievances, their own history. They might be unreasonable. They might be selfish. They might be actively hostile. Achieving harmony with your neighbor requires constant effort. It requires empathy, compromise, forgiveness, and communication. It requires looking past your own needs and seeing someone else's. It requires building trust and maintaining it over time. In Egypt, you could be a hermit in the desert and still be in harmony with Ma'at. You could meditate on the cosmic order and feel at peace. But in the Mesopotamian view of Shulmu, you can't do that. You need other people. You need community. And community is messy. So I think the answer is clear. Harmony with your neighbor is harder. It's messier, more demanding, and requires skills that not everyone possesses. Cosmic harmony is a solo pursuit. Community harmony is a collaborative one. But here's the thing, I do think both are necessary. Cosmic harmony gives us perspective. It reminds us that we're part of something larger than our petty conflicts. It humbles us. Community harmony gives us connection. It reminds us that we're not alone, that we need each other, and that our actions affect those around us. The Egyptian and the Mesopotamian worldviews each emphasized one of these, and I think we need both. We need the peace of understanding our place in the cosmos, and we need the peace of living well with our neighbors. Neither one is easy, but both are worth pursuing. Our essay reads, the Sumerian legal system had inequality baked into it. Higher classes faced harsher punishments than commoners, but they were also more protected. Egypt's concept of Ma'at was about restoring cosmic balance. If you had to live under one system, which would you choose? A flawed, pragmatic system that treats people unequally, but is honest about it? Or an idealistic system that claims to be about cosmic justice, but is still run by fallible humans? This is one of those questions where I think our modern sensibilities make us want to choose the idealistic system, but I'm not sure that's actually the right answer. Let's take a look at the Sumerian system first. It's brutally honest about its inequality. The law doesn't pretend to be fair. If a nobleman commits a crime against a commoner, he pays a fine. If a commoner commits the same crime against a nobleman, he loses an eye, or a hand, or his life. The law is a reflection of the social hierarchy, not a challenge to it. But there's an upside to this honesty. Everyone knows where they stand. There's no pretense of equal justice. The system doesn't gaslight you into believing you're equal when you're not. You know that the laws protect the powerful and punish the weak. And because you know that, you can navigate the system accordingly. You don't expect fairness, so you're not constantly disappointed. Also, and this is important, the Sumerian system applied harsher punishments to the upper classes when they were found guilty. If a nobleman was convicted, the punishment was more severe than it would have been for a commoner. This is a fascinating flip side. The powerful are more protected, but they're also more accountable when they're caught. The law doesn't protect them from consequences, it simply gives them a longer fall. Now, the Egyptian system. Ma'at is the principle of cosmic truth, justice, and balance. The law, in theory, reflects this cosmic order. Everyone is equal before Ma'at. Your heart is weighed against the feather of truth, and your status on earth doesn't really matter. The system claims to be just. But here's the problem. The system is still run by humans, and humans are fallible, corrupt, and self-interested. The claim to cosmic justice can become a justification for earthly injustice. If the pharaoh is the embodiment of Ma'at, then whatever the pharaoh does is just. The system can't be questioned because it's divinely sanctioned. This is the danger of idealistic systems. They can become rigid, authoritarian, and resistant to reform. So, which should we choose? This might surprise people, but I think I would choose the Mesopotamian system. Here's why. I would choose it because I value honesty over pretense. A system that admits its inequality is a system that can be challenged. You can say, this law is unjust, and I know it's unjust because the law itself doesn't claim to be just. Let's change it. A system that claims to be divinely just is much harder to change. You're not just arguing against a law, you're arguing against the cosmos itself. The Egyptian system sounds beautiful, but it's ultimately a system where the powerful can claim divine authority for their actions. The Mesopotamian system is uglier, but it's also more honest. It says, we're powerful and we're going to protect ourselves, but we're also going to be harsh on ourselves when we step out of line. I think there's a lesson here for modern societies. We often claim to believe in equal justice under law. We talk about justice being blind, but we all know that the system is rigged in favor of the wealthy and powerful. We know it, but we pretend otherwise. The hypocrisy is corrosive. The Mesopotamians didn't pretend. They built inequality into the legal code, and that honesty, however brutal, might be preferable to our modern pretense of fairness that everyone knows is a lie. These two ancient philosophies also have a difference in the vision of what happens after you die. In Egypt, as we discussed in our first essay, the afterlife was a place of pleasant continuation. You got to take your stuff with you. You were judged by Osiris. Your heart was weighed against the feather of Maat. And if you were a good person, you entered the field of reeds. It was a green, beautiful, paradisiacal version of Egypt. It was a second eternal life. The essay said the Egyptian concept of an afterlife was pleasant. Now let's look at Mesopotamia. The text paints a starkly different picture. The essay says Mesopotamians considered the underworld, known as Kurnugia or Sheol, as a dim, dismal place. Hence, their approach to life was fatalistic and pessimistic, with ethics considered in terms of earthly consequences only. This is a devastatingly bleak vision. The underworld, or Kurnugia in Sumerian, means the land of no return. You go there when you die. And what's it like? Imagine a place made of dust, a house of darkness. The people there don't have a real life. They are like shadows or ghosts. They eat dust and they drink mud. The hero Gilgamesh is told by his friend Enkidu that the underworld is a place where people are like a bird in a net. There is no joy, there is no sunlight. Think about the psychological weight of that. In Egypt, you lived your life in the knowledge that you are building a legacy and a life for the next world. It gave your actions on earth cosmic significance. In Mesopotamia, if the afterlife is just a dim, dreary shadow world, then the only thing that truly matters is your life on earth. But if your life on earth is a life of toil, uncertainty, and the whims of angry gods, then the whole enterprise seems a bit pointless. This is the foundation of Mesopotamian fatalism. The phrase, eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die, is a perfect encapsulation of this worldview. It's not a hedonistic call to excess, it's a desperate cry against the void. Since there's no hope in the next world, you have to find what meaning you can in this one, even if it's fleeting. Our text says ethics are considered in terms of earthly consequences only. This makes sense. If you're a Mesopotamian, you don't do good things because you'll be rewarded in the afterlife. There is no reward. You do good things to maintain order on earth, to avoid punishment from the gods in your current life, or to keep your village from being destroyed. The motivation is survival, appeasement, and a grim determination to avoid the wrath of the divine here and now. It's a very practical, pragmatic, and human centric morality, even as it's framed in religious terms. So, the Egyptians had a beautiful, pleasant afterlife to look forward to. The Mesopotamians had a dim, dusty underworld where everyone good or bad just existed as shadows. If you genuinely believed that death was the end of all joy and meaning, how would that change the way you live your life? Would it make you more or less moral? This is the existential question at the heart of Mesopotamian philosophy, and I think it's one that we all grapple with on some level, whether we realize it or not. The Mesopotamian afterlife, Kornugia, is a terrible place. It's a house of dust, a land of darkness, where the dead eat mud and drink brackish water. There's no judgment, no reward for the virtuous, no punishment for the wicked. Everyone ends up in the same dim, dreary place. It's not hell in the Christian sense. There's no fire or torment, but it's not heaven either. It's just emptiness. Now, if you genuinely believed this was your fate, how would it change your life? First, it would change your relationship to morality. In Egypt, you were moral because you wanted to pass the judgment of Ma'at and enjoy a pleasant afterlife. In Mesopotamia, there's no such incentive. You can't earn a better afterlife through good behavior. The afterlife is the same for everyone. So, what's the point of being good? Well, the Mesopotamian answer is pragmatic. You're good because it makes life on earth better. Good behavior creates shulmu, community well being that leads to peace. And if you're a liar, a thief, or a murderer, you're creating chaos. You make life harder for everyone. And life on earth is hard enough already. So you're good not because you're building a reward in the next life, but because you're making this life bearable. This is a profoundly secular motivation for morality. It's based on consequences in this world, not promises in the next. If I cheat my neighbor suffers. If I cheat my neighbor too many times, my neighbor's family suffers. And then my neighbor might retaliate, and then we're both worse off. So I don't cheat my neighbor, not because I'm afraid of divine punishment, but because I want to live in a community that functions. Second, it would change your relationship to pleasure and to meaning. If this life is all you've got, you're going to cherish it more. The Mesopotamian eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die attitude is not hedonism. It's a desperate clutching at whatever joy life offers before the darkness comes. You appreciate the good things more because you know they're finite. But there's a darker side to this too. If this life is all there is, then despair is a real danger. Why strive for anything if it all ends in dust? Why build a city if it will be swallowed by the desert? Why love someone if they'll be swallowed by the darkness of the underworld? This is the tension at the heart of Mesopotamian philosophy. It's a worldview that demands you find meaning in a world that ultimately denies meaning. It asks you to be good without promise of a reward, to build without promise of permanence, to love without promise of reunion. So would this make you more or less moral? I think the honest answer is it depends on the person. For some people, the absence of an afterlife incentive would lead to nihilism. If nothing matters, why not do whatever you want? These are the people who would become less moral. But for others, the absence of an afterlife incentive would make morality more authentic. You're not being good because you're buying a ticket to paradise. You're being good because it's the right thing to do. Your morality is not transactional, it's integral. These are the people who would become more moral. I think we see this tension in modern secularism. Some people, freed from religious constraints, embrace a life of hedonism or selfishness. Others, freed from religious constraints, develop a deeper, more personal commitment to ethics that doesn't depend on divine reward. The Mesopotamians, faced with this tension, chose to emphasize community well being. They built cities, codified laws, and developed complex social structures. They found meaning not in a promise of personal salvation, but in the collective flourishing of their civilization. That's a remarkably mature response to existential despair. So, what happened to this world of temperamental gods, substitute kings, and a dusty, gloomy underworld? How did it end, and what did it leave behind? The political end is well known: conquest by larger empires, first the Assyrians, then the Babylonians, then the Persians, and finally Alexander the Great. But the philosophical end is far more complex and influential. The essay tells us that the Mesopotamian worldview had a transcultural binding force that was religious tradition. It was this shared religious and cultural framework that persisted and was absorbed by the cultures that came afterwards. The Mesopotamians didn't just disappear, their ideas were a seedbed for the religions of the Levant, including our own. Let's look at the textual lineage the essay provides for the Bible. The Old Testament didn't appear in a vacuum. As it says, the Hebraic kingship is notable as being primarily secular in responsibility. Interaction with and representation of Yahweh was the responsibility of a separate priesthood. This idea of a king who is a secular leader, answerable to a separate religious authority, has its antecedents in Mesopotamia. The king is not a god, he is a man who must answer to a god. In Egypt, the Neteru were intelligible through nature. You could understand them through reason and observation. In Mesopotamia, the gods were willful and unpredictable. The Hebrews took this even further, saying Yahweh isn't intelligible through reason or logic at all, but only through prophecy and history. Which is more comforting, a God you can study like a science, or a God who remains a mystery you can only experience? This is a deeply personal question, and I suspect different people will have radically different answers depending on their temperament. Let's start with the Egyptian model. The Neteru are intelligible. They are the principles of nature. The sun is Ra, the Nile is Hapi, the sky is Nut. If you want to understand the gods, you study the world. You observe the cycles, the patterns, the regularities. You do astronomy and mathematics and medicine. The gods are knowable because they are the very fabric of a knowable universe. This is profoundly comforting if you're someone who values reason, order, and predictability. The universe is not chaotic, it's ordered. The gods are not capricious, they're consistent. You can trust the patterns. You can build your life around them. You can achieve a kind of intellectual peace because you understand how the world works. But there's a downside. If the gods are knowable, they're also somewhat small. They're finite. They're bound by the principles they represent. You can study them, categorize them, predict them. They're not mysterious. They're not awe-inspiring in the way that a truly transcendent being would be. They're more like cosmic bureaucrats than infinite deities. Now look at the Hebrew model. Yahweh is not intelligible through reason or logic. You can't study Yahweh like a science. You can't observe Yahweh's patterns and predict Yahweh's behavior. Yahweh is not a principle of nature. Yahweh is like a person, and persons are unpredictable. How do you understand Yahweh? Only through prophecy and history. Prophecy is about receiving direct communication from God, often in ways that defy reason. History is about looking backward and seeing God's hand in events, sometimes in ways that are difficult to explain. It's not a system, it's a relationship. This is comforting if you're someone who values mystery, transcendence, and personal connection. The universe is not just a machine, it's like a conversation. God is not just a principle, God is a presence. You can't reduce God to a formula or a law. God is always beyond your understanding, always surprising you, always inviting you into deeper relationship. But there's a downside to this too. If God is not intelligible through reason, then how do you know what God wants? How do you know if you're doing the right thing? You can't just observe nature and deduce God's will. You have to rely on prophets, on scriptures, on subjective experiences, and those are all open to interpretation and manipulation. You can justify almost anything by claiming it's God's will. So, which is more comforting? I think it depends on what you're looking for. If you're looking for security, the Egyptian model is more comforting. The universe makes sense. The gods are predictable. You can build a stable life based on stable principles. If you're looking for meaning, the Hebrew model is more comforting. The universe is not just a machine, it's a story. God is not just a principle, God is a presence. You're not just an observer, you're a participant in something larger than yourself. Personally, I find both appealing. The Egyptian model gives me intellectual peace. The Hebrew model gives me existential excitement. I want a universe that makes sense, but I also want a universe that surprises me. I want gods I can study, but I also want a God I can pray to. Maybe that's why I find the Mesopotamian middle ground so fascinating. The gods were willful and unpredictable, but they were also, in some sense, knowable through divination and ritual. The Mesopotamians were constantly trying to understand the divine, constantly trying to read the signs and interpret the omens. They were seeking a middle path between the knowable gods of Egypt and the unknowable God of Israel. Now look at the progression of Hebrew religion. The text says it went through 4 stages: pre Mosaic animism, national monolatry, monotheism, and finally dualism, which they adapted from Persian Zoroastrianism. But before they got to a single god like Yahweh, they were monolatrous. They believed in many gods, but chose to worship only one. It was in Mesopotamia, surrounded by the Babylonians, that many of these foundational Hebrew ideas were first encountered, rejected, and reshaped. The essay also mentions some key dates. The Hebraic Ten Commandments are now dated by most Old Testament scholars to 600 BC, some 700 years later than the Exodus. This is a massive historical point. The Exodus story, with the giving of the law at Sinai, is placed around 1300 BC. But scholars now say the Ten Commandments, as we know them, were written down nearly 700 years later, during the Babylonian Exile. Are you paying attention? Because the essay just dropped a bombshell. The Ten Commandments, as we know them, were probably written down around 600 BC, not during the Exodus 700 years earlier. The Israelites were living in Babylonian exile when they codified their laws. Does this change how we view the originality of the biblical tradition? Or is it more impressive that they took Mesopotamian ideas and reshaped them into something so enduring? This is the kind of historical detail that can be genuinely unsettling if you've been raised with a particular understanding of the Bible. And I think the honest answer is that it should change how we view the biblical tradition, but it doesn't have to be in a negative way. Let's start with the facts. The traditional story is that Moses received the Ten Commandments on Mount Sinai around 1300 BC, during the Exodus from Egypt. The Israelites carried these laws with them, and they formed the foundation of their covenant with Yahweh. The historical reality, according to most modern scholars, is actually much messier. The Ten Commandments, as we have them in the Bible, were likely codified around 600 BC, and that's during the Babylonian exile. The Israelites had been conquered by the Babylonians, their temple had been destroyed, and they were living as exiles in a foreign land. Why does this matter? Because it means the Israelites didn't just receive the law out of nowhere. They received it in conversation with Babylonian culture. They were surrounded by Mesopotamian laws, Mesopotamian myths, Mesopotamian theology. The Code of Hammurabi, which dates to around 1750 BC, contains many parallels to the laws that are in the Old Testament, such as an eye for an eye, the protection of the weak, the regulation of property. These ideas were already part of the Mesopotamian legal tradition. So the question becomes, does this diminish the Bible's originality? Does it mean the Israelites were just copying from their neighbors? I think the answer is no. In fact, I think it makes the biblical tradition maybe more impressive, not less. Here's why. The Israelites didn't just copy, they transformed. They took the raw materials of Mesopotamian culture and reshaped them into something new and distinctive. Consider the concept of law. In Mesopotamia, the law came from the king. Hammurabi received his code from the sun god Shamash. But it was Hammurabi's code. It was the king's will, enforced by the king's authority. In Israel, the law came straight from Yahweh. It wasn't the king's law, it was God's law. The king was subordinate to the law. This was a revolutionary idea. It meant that no human authority, not even the king, was above the law. The law was transcendent. Consider the concept of time. Mesopotamian time was cyclical. The Hebrews made it linear. They introduced the idea of a unique, unrepeatable history with a divine purpose. This was also revolutionary. It meant that human beings were not trapped in an endless cycle. They were moving toward a destiny. Consider the concept of God. Mesopotamian gods were part of the divine family. Yahweh was alone. He was the only God. This was the most revolutionary idea of them all. It meant that the universe was not a collection of competing powers. It was a single unified reality under one sovereign will. So yes, the Israelites borrowed from Mesopotamia, but they didn't just borrow, they transformed. They took the raw materials of their culture and reshaped them into something utterly new. That's not plagiarism, that's creativity, that's innovation. And here's the deeper point. This is how culture works. No tradition just develops itself in isolation. Every great idea is built on earlier ideas. The Israelites were shaped by Mesopotamia, yes, just as Christianity was shaped by Judaism, just as Islam was shaped by Christianity and Judaism. We're all standing on the shoulders of those who came before us. The beauty of the biblical tradition is not that it was created ex nihilo, out of nothing. The beauty is that it took the best of what came before and elevated it, refined it, and gave it new meaning. That's what makes it enduring. That's why we're still talking about it today. Let's think about this a little bit more. The Israelites were forced to live in Babylon, the great Mesopotamian city. They were surrounded by the descendants of the people who wrote the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic, and the Epic of Gilgamesh. And it was during this period of exile, sitting in the shadow of Mesopotamian ziggurats, that they codified their own laws and solidified their own unique theology. It's a direct and undeniable cultural and intellectual connection. And what about the dualism that came later? The essay traces it to Persia, but it takes the Mesopotamian concept of divine conflict and transforms it. The idea of a cosmic battle between the forces of good and evil, Ahura Mazda versus Ahriman, and later it turned into Yahweh versus Satan. And this starts to crystallize. This is a huge departure. In Egypt, there was no Satan. There was no cosmic enemy of the gods. The Neteru are part of the natural order, and they work in concert. In early Mesopotamia, the gods are often at war with each other or fighting monsters like Tiamat. But that's a conflict within the divine family, not a war between a god and his ultimate adversary. The Persian dualism and its Hebrew adaptation gives rise to a concept of linear time and purposeful cosmic battle. Our essay notes that hence the Hebrews adopted a linear concept of time, as well as the notion of a covenant between mankind and Yahweh. Mankind is thus given a mission and or a destiny. This is the complete inversion of the Egyptian worldview. The Egyptians had a cyclical time, a repeating pattern, and a goal of eternal harmony. The Hebrews adopted a linear time from the broader Mesopotamian world, a time with a beginning, a middle, and an end, with a battle to be fought and a mission to be accomplished. The Egyptians had seen time as cyclical, an endless pattern of renewal. Let's look at this. Which worldview would create a more psychologically healthy human being? Knowing you have a unique destiny to fulfill, or knowing that you're part of an eternal, repeating cycle? This is another question that cuts right to the core of human psychology, and both worldviews offer real benefits and real costs. Let's start with the Egyptian view. Cyclical time. The world is a pattern of renewal. The sun rises and sets. The Nile floods and recedes. The seasons cycle. You're born, you live, you die. And then, if you lived correctly, you're reborn in the field of reeds. Life is a wheel and you're a spoke. You have a role, but the wheel keeps turning, whether you're there or not. The psychological benefit here is peace. You're not carrying the weight of the world. The universe is stable. It doesn't depend on you. Your actions don't change the cosmic order. They just either align with it or they don't. There's a certain release in that. You're not responsible for history. You're just responsible for being part of the pattern. The cost, however, is a potential lack of significance. If everything is cyclical, then nothing is truly new. You're not creating, you're repeating. There's no ultimate goal, no final destination. The wheel keeps turning, and your contribution, however meaningful it may be to you, is ultimately just another turn of the wheel. Now, let's take a look at the Hebrew view, linear time. The world has a beginning, a middle, and an end. The beginning is creation. The middle is the unfolding of God's plan throughout history. The end is the Messianic age, the final victory of good over evil. You're not just a spoke, you're a character in a story, and that story has a narrative arc, a climax, and a resolution. The psychological benefit here is significance. You're not just passing through, you're a part of something. You have a role in the cosmic drama. Your actions matter. They contribute to the unfolding of God's plan. You're building something that will last forever. The cost is enormous pressure. If you have a destiny, you can fail it. If you have a mission, you can screw it up. If history is heading toward a final judgment, every choice you make has cosmic weight. There's no room for just coasting through life. Everything matters, and that can be exhausting. So, which is more psychologically healthy? Well, it depends on the person. Some people thrive on purpose. They need to feel that their life has meaning and direction. For them, the linear vision is liberating. It gives them a reason to get up in the morning. However, other people are crushed by purpose. They don't want to carry the weight of destiny. They want to live in peace, to enjoy the simple pleasures of existence. For them, the cyclical vision is liberating. It frees them from the burden of significance. I think the healthiest approach might be a balance. Recognize that you're part of an ongoing story, but don't let the story consume you. Understand that your actions have meaning, but also understand that you're not solely responsible for the outcome. The wheel turns, but you're still a spoke. The story unfolds, but you're still a character. The Mesopotamians and the Hebrews gave us the linear sense of time, the sense that we're moving towards something. The Egyptians gave us the cyclical sense, the sense that we're part of an eternal pattern. I think we need both. We need the sense of purpose and we need the sense of peace. And another thing, whatever happened to the grim Mesopotamian afterlife? Cornugia, the land of no return. It didn't disappear, it evolved. It became Sheol in the Hebrew Bible, the place of the dead, a land of forgetfulness, where all go, good and evil, and where there is no praise of God. It is dark, silent, and dreary. It's not the Greek Hades, which had different sections for heroes and sinners. It's much closer to the older, bleaker Mesopotamian vision of death. It's a fascinating lineage. The Egyptians believed in a pleasant paradise. The Mesopotamians believed in a place of dust and shadows. The Hebrews, building on the Mesopotamian foundation, initially had a very similar vision of Sheol. It was only later, with the influence of dualism and a more developed concept of a personal afterlife, that ideas of heaven and hell began to emerge more clearly. The Western idea of hell, with its fire and brimstone, actually owes more to Greek and later Christian synthesis than to the original Mesopotamian Cornugia. But the initial feeling of dread, the separation from God, the sense of a tragic end, that is a profound inheritance from the land between the rivers. So let's return to the question we posed at the beginning. What is the legacy of this ancient, pessimistic, yet deeply influential way of thinking? We saw Egypt, a culture of stability, seeking a geometric perfection and a harmony with the divine principles of nature. It was a culture that believed its ruler was a god and that death was a gateway to a beautiful and eternal life. Then we saw Mesopotamia, a culture born of chaos, seeking to survive the whims of temperamental gods. It was a culture that saw its kings as managers, men who could be sacrificed, and that envisioned death as a dark, dusty, and final end. It was, as the essay says, fatalistic and pessimistic indeed. Egypt gave us the concept of the living God. Mesopotamia gave us the concept of the suffering servant. the king who is just a man, the civilization that must manage the divine instead of embodying it. Egypt gave us the beautiful tomb. Mesopotamia gave us the bleak lament and the shattered clay tablet. And yet, standing here in the present day, we see that Mesopotamian worldview didn't just die. It was the fertile soil in which the roots of our own Western consciousness were planted. It gave us a God who is separate from us, a world that is a stage for a cosmic conflict between good and evil, and a linear sense of time driving toward a destiny. It gave us a sense of vulnerability before a powerful and inscrutable universe. The Egyptian philosophy is the philosophy of the sun, warm, radiant, stable, predictable. The Mesopotamian philosophy can be seen as the philosophy of the blood, visceral, fearful, unpredictable, and driven by the will to survive. It is the philosophy of a world where you must appease the powers that be, not just harmonize with them. These two ancient powers, Egypt and Mesopotamia, set the stage for everything that followed. The Egyptian worldview gave us the living God king and a paradise in the afterlife. The Mesopotamian worldview gave us the vulnerable king, the scapegoat, the linear sense of destiny, and the deep fear of divine wrath. Looking at modern politics, religion, and popular culture, which ancient philosophy are we actually living under? Are we more Egyptian or are we more Mesopotamian? This is a big one. This is the question that ties everything together and forces us to look at ourselves in the mirror of history. Let's start with a bold claim. I think we are fundamentally Mesopotamian. I think the Egyptian worldview is a beautiful, seductive fantasy, but we are living in a Mesopotamian reality. Let me walk you through this. First, look at our politics. Do we have living God kings? No. We have vulnerable human leaders who are constantly under scrutiny, constantly at risk of being exposed, constantly facing the possibility of scandal, defeat, or ruin. Our leaders are not divine embodiments of cosmic order. They are flawed humans who serve at the pleasure of the people, or at least of the powerful. And what do we do when a leader faces a crisis? We look for a scapegoat. We find a subordinate, an advisor, a bureaucrat to take the fall. We don't believe in divine wrath, but we believe in public anger. The mechanisms are the same. The substitute king is alive and well, just in secular form. Second, let's look at our sense of time. We definitely are in a linear culture. We believe in progress, in destiny, in moving towards something. We talk about making history and leaving a legacy. We see time as a line stretching from the past through the present and into the future. We are not Egyptians, content to repeat the cycles of the seasons. We are Mesopotamians and Hebrews, always reaching towards something new. Third, look at our relationship to the divine. Even among secular people, there's a deep suspicion of the universe. We talk about the universe as if it has a will. We say the universe is testing me, or the universe has a plan. This is Mesopotamian thinking. The universe is not a stable, predictable machine. It's a place of challenges, tests, and unpredictable forces. Fourth, look at our view of death. We don't believe in the field of reeds. Most of us don't believe in a pleasant paradise-like afterlife. We believe in uncertainty. We hope for something, but we fear nothingness. The Mesopotamian dread of the underworld is still with us today. It's just been secularized into a fear of oblivion. And fifth, look at our morality. We don't believe we're earning cosmic merit. We believe we're building a better society. We talk about leaving the world a better place for our children. That can be considered sholmu. That's community well-being. That's the Mesopotamian vision of ethics as pragmatic and social, not cosmic and personal. So I think the answer is pretty clear. We are living under a Mesopotamian worldview. We just don't acknowledge it because we've dressed it up in secular clothing. Here's the twist, though. I think we miss the Egyptian worldview. I think we long for it. That's why we're so drawn to fantasies of utopia, to stories of perfect societies, to images of cosmic harmony. The Egyptian vision of a stable, ordered, meaningful universe is deeply appealing to us because we don't have it. We are Mesopotamian in our reality, but we are Egyptian in our dreams. And maybe that's the point. Maybe we need both. We need the Mesopotamian realism that keeps us honest, that reminds us that life is hard, that forces us to confront the chaos and build community despite it. And we need the Egyptian idealism that keeps us hopeful, that reminds us that order and beauty are possible, that encourages us to reach for something higher. The Mesopotamians taught us how to survive. The Egyptians taught us how to dream. We are the heirs of both, and the challenge of our time is to find a way to live in both worlds. So, to answer the question, we are more Mesopotamian than we want to admit, but we are also, in our deepest longings, still Egyptian. And that tension, I think, is what makes us human. So tonight, on the ruby tablet, we have seen that the darker, more tragic vision of Mesopotamia might just be the one that shaped us more. In our next episode, we'll explore the Great Transformation, the dawn of Greek philosophy. How did a culture that began with the epic poetry of Homer and the violent cosmology of Hesiod suddenly pivot to the rationalism of Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle? It is the story of how the blood of Mesopotamia met the mind of the Aegean. Until then, keep your eyes open, read the signs, remember the rivers that built our world and the darkness that taught us to look for the light. This has been the Ruby Tablet. Join us next time for more magic, spirituality, and philosophy of the left-hand path.